Hey everybody, Mike Rossi here, welcoming you once again to my YouTube channel. It's been a while since I've posted original analytical content. In fact, it's been a while since I've posted really anything. There was one video that I uploaded about a week and a half ago that Vladimir Putin had just a short interview that he had given in the, sort of like in the hallway of the Moscow State University to Pavel Zarubin about the upcoming meeting, the inevitable meeting between him and Donald Trump. To be fair, I have been looking for press conferences and other major statements, either coming out of the Kremlin or the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And aside from a few things that are really the same things that we've been hearing about for the last couple of months, nothing new yet. My guess is that all eyes are waiting and preparing for this upcoming meeting between Trump and Putin. But obviously, there's been a lot going on in the 2 to 3 weeks since Donald Trump was once again inaugurated president. And I gave a talk at Webster University, which, as many of you know, I'm back at here in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. I've been here for about a month now. And I gave a talk about a week ago on the geopolitical world in 2025, Trump, Ukraine, China, and multipolarism. I gave the same talk, although albeit a little bit changed, augmented, earlier today to a collection of internationals who are all living here in Tashkent in a nice coffee house, which sort of tells me that the best classes to offer really should be in coffee houses, tea houses, pubs, or all of the above here. But I wanted to take what is really my initial assessment of where we are in 2025 and what we can expect to see in the coming weeks and months for my YouTube channel and for all of you, whom I am absolutely grateful for remaining fans, dedicated loyalists over the years. As you know, I am now over 50,000 subscribers. Many of you are also supporting me on Patreon. I couldn't be happier. And as I've said before, and I'm saying now, my ultimate goal is to eventually transition to online public scholarship once my stint in institutionalized academia comes to an end that I feel, should, reach. But that's, not for, at least a couple of months now. But in any event, I guess that since Trump has taken office, if there's any real, analytics that are coming out of the social media news channels, the YouTube channels and other podcasts, it's making sense of Trump's rhetoric. How serious is he in terms of things like turning the Gaza Strip into a beachfront resort, or making Canada the 51st state, acquiring Greenland, either by purchase or military takeover, retaking the Panama Canal, sort of taking on China, coming to terms with Russia over Ukraine, possibly leaving NATO, all sorts of things that people are wondering, is he serious about this? Or is this just, bluster and bravado? So what I'm hoping to do here is give you my own assessment. And like anybody that offers their assessments, online, they're just that. They're just predictions. Nothing is guaranteed to come true, but it's based on what we've seen and what we can, rationally deduce. So I think the first thing to note is that Trump is resuming his position as U.S. president in a world a little bit different from what it was in 2016. Whether it's a new world, a newer world, what is abundant is that American power and influence is undeniably taking place in an increasingly multipolar world, right? And if you have followed me over the years or have listened to my guest, talks on other YouTube channels, you know what multipolarism is all about. But you also will probably agree that the United States, or at least U.S. leadership, is kind of like the last to the party in admitting that the world is multipolar. So whether the United States wants to admit it or not, right, American power in, Trump's second term is happening in an increasingly multipolar and multilateral world. And, how the United States sees itself and others in the world today is still critically important, because if you also have followed me over the years, you know that I'm a constructivist. And the understanding of constructivism is the way in which a state perceives itself to be and perceives other states in the world. So this is the reason why the United States has somewhat of a selective diplomacy towards some countries over others. So Israel is seen as one of America's key strategic partners around the world that can absolutely do no wrong, while Iran is public enemy number one. Russia is seen as a belligerent power trying to exert its influence in places that it no longer has, while Ukraine is the scrappy little, liberal democracy that's just trying to get into Europe. North Korea is seen as a rogue state along with, let's say, Iran, while Saudi Arabia, a country with egregious human rights records, is sort of given a free pass, right? So this is sort of a way in which constructivism, more than anything else, helps to explain why U.S. foreign policy is as random, as it tends to be. This is taking place along the growth of international regionalism that's connected to other great powers. So along with the United States, I think no one here is going to deny China and Russia are, key regional powers. India could possibly be, a fourth. And, by the time we get to like fourth or fifth or sixth countries, we're really getting more and more localized. But here I'm talking about regionalism, not just simply raw great power itself. So the US, China, and Russia in 2025, I think, are clearly creating spheres of influence around its areas, right? China is certainly exerting influence in East Asia, the East and South China Sea. Russia is looking to, maintain its influence over Belarus, as well as regain influence over Ukraine, while certainly maintaining, legacy influences within Central Asia. And as far as the United States is concerned, you have the transatlantic alliances that have, been in place since the end of the Second World War, but also, and this is key to look at, I would say the United States is going to redouble its efforts to regain influence in Latin America. And if the new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, is to be taken at his word, and I'm no fan of Rubio, but he said in an interview, this might have been about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, so shortly after he was appointed as Secretary of State, that the United States now exists in a multipolar world. He openly admitted that multipolarism is the reality of the world today, which is a major departure from previous administrations, most notably the Biden administration, which wants to, or wanted to, still believe that the United States was this global force for good, and that it really is the moral compass throughout the entire world. I think that part of Rubio's acknowledgement is the expansion of alternative organizations from the so-called global south. And it's a term, do we call it the developing world, the global south, the rest versus the west? It's sort of up for interpretation, but sort of the non-Western countries are exerting more influence within expanding organizations like Shanghai Cooperation Organization and most notably BRICS. As many of you know, BRICS membership expanded in the last couple of years to include Ethiopia, United Arab Emirates, Iran, and Egypt. Now, Saudi Arabia was also given membership position, but has yet to fully incorporate itself into that. But it's really only a matter of time. This past January, right on January the 1st, BRICS did get its newest member, Indonesia. So along with the original 5, BRICS now has an additional 5, including Indonesia. When Saudi Arabia finally ends up joining, that will be the 11th member. as well as a number of partner states. Now, this is an interesting thing here because we're not talking about member states officially, but partner states like Belarus and Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan that cooperate rather closely with BRICS. And this may even be seen as a gateway, right, towards full membership. And, with all of this, we tend to look at, or what's left of, the transatlantic partnerships that were created at the end of the Second World War, but the relationship, let's say, between the United States and Europe are seeming more like dependencies. It doesn't really seem to me like this is a one-to-one cooperation anymore. It seems like, the hour of Europe, which is something that was mentioned about 30 years ago when the Cold War had ended, right? The hour of Europe, the moment that Europe can take its place in the world as a united collectivity of states, most notably through the European Union, I think has seemingly passed. Now, not to say that the EU is going to collapse, but it's becoming really a peripheral element. As I've said in a couple of interviews, the European Union today really seems more like an economic appendage of NATO, and NATO is really just the military wing of the United States. So, I think if we were to really think about where is Europe in the world today, I go to what Politico had posted on X. I think somewhere around half of last year or something like at this time of growing global instability, the most sobering realization for the continent should be this: no one cares what Europe thinks. And with, people like Trump, on one side and Putin on the other, and the absence of any real authoritative, legitimate leader in Europe, since, let's say, Angela Merkel, Europe is just kind of in the middle of everything. I mean, if you can really tell me who is the new leader of Europe today, I mean, I'd be willing to, hear you out. But if your answer is Emmanuel Macron, I got some bad news for you. If he's the best that you can think of, Europe is in, sort of dire straits these days. So I guess in this sense, I want to begin with probably the most important question in this entire discussion, and that is what to make of Trump's rhetoric. How serious is he? How serious is he in making some of these statements like Canada, the 51st state, right? You may have recalled a tweet of his where he had said, Canadians love America. They'd be better off in the United States. What's the likelihood of this happening? What about acquiring Greenland? He had talked about purchasing Greenland from Denmark. And if that's not going to happen, he might go so far as to really push the autonomous movement in Greenland to openly declare independence from Denmark, in which case we could see a diplomatic recognition from the United States, followed by a newly independent Greenlandian government, Greenlandic, you get the idea, right? Government agreeing to, military bases, some kind of economic contracts with the United States, something like that, right? I mean, how serious is he on this? Taking over the Panama Canal, right? He's talked about how the United States returning the Panama Canal to Panama, I forget when this was, in the 1980s, whatever, was a huge mistake, right? This should be U.S. property. He's trying to make it, American owned once again, despite the fact that the Panama Canal is really more internationally owned than, really owned by the state of Panama itself. This is probably the most controversial of all of them, and that is turning Gaza into some beachfront resort, something in which the United States would acquire the Gaza Strip. The Palestinians would be, escorted out, which, of course, according to Trump, they'd be absolutely happy to do so, because why would they want to live in piles of rubble? In which case, Trump would turn Gaza into some kind of amalgamated hybrid of beachfront timeshares along with oil drills and mining companies, to which the Israeli government of Benjamin Netanyahu thinks this is just the greatest idea in the world. In between all of this, Trump has mentioned more than once on invading Mexico to combat the drug cartels. If the Mexican government can't do this, the U.S. would do it on its own. Reaching a détente with Russia over Ukraine. This was probably one of the longest running statements that he's been making ever since his campaign. He said if he gets elected, the first thing he's going to do is end the war in Ukraine. He can end this war, right, according to Trump, within 24 hours. And if you listened to his inauguration speech, this was certainly inserted by, the Doge emperor himself, Elon Musk, something about going all Weyland-Yutani on Mars. I don't know about that one. Personally, in my opinion, I would rather the money that we would spend on Mars, I'd like to, have healthcare or a better infrastructure or something that would get rid of congestion pricing in New York. But, I've played Doom 3 back in the day, and I know that trying to colonize Mars is just, absolutely catastrophic. But okay, look, let's separate rhetoric from reality here. Obviously, talks about Canada and Greenland, right? This is basically Danish territory, are a violation of other states' sovereignty. So unless there is some kind of crazy environment in which the governments of Canada and Denmark are willing to cede territory or cede sovereignty to the United States, I mean, this is, if nothing more than rhetoric, we're talking about a full-blown invasion. Before I even get to the Palestinian issue, I had sort of mused at one point on another YouTube channel that both Canada and Denmark are members of NATO, in which they could, if they really wanted to, invoke Article 5, which, if that's the case, then the world that we're living in is that an Article 5 NATO declaration would be issued against the United States and not Russia, which if that were to happen, I'm somehow going to find my way to Moscow and see if I can share a bottle of vodka with Sergei Lavrov, because we're both going to be enjoying that one. But, talks about this stuff, obviously violate other countries' territory as well as sovereignty. The forced expulsion of Palestinians is nothing more than barefaced ethnic cleansing, which, if that happens, I mean, it means that the world has done absolutely nothing to counter these attempts, right, by the U.S. or by Israel. Now, right now, this has been met with resounding opposition and condemnation, not just from the Palestinians, but from the Egyptian, Saudi, and Jordanian governments. The European Union has condemned this. The German government has condemned this. Russia, China has condemned this. Condemning is one thing. But here's the other thing that we need to think about. What if Trump gives Israel the green light to just simply say, go on into Gaza and force them out, force them through the southern gates into Egypt, and that's it? No people, no problem. You get rid of, an unruly group of people as far as the Israeli and American governments are concerned. And it's not like this hasn't happened before, unfortunately. As far as the Panama Canal, I've already said it's more international than Panamanian. I mean, yes, it is owned and controlled by Panama itself, but because it is an international conduit, right? It's an international corridor. Other international interests, especially the Chinese, have stock and investment within this. So, if Trump were to, get the troops ready to invade Panama and occupy the Panama Canal, this would result in enormous economic repercussions, not just for the United States, but it would create hostilities between major countries like the U.S. and China, Japan, the rest of Latin America and such. So talk is one thing, actions are something else. When it comes to Ukraine, right, Trump is talking about ending the war as soon as possible. And many people are thinking that he is going to throw Ukraine under the bus, that he is giving Ukraine to Russia. A lot of people tend to forget Trump is, more than anything else, a businessman. Now, it doesn't matter whether that's successful or not, but Trump will look at everything in dollar signs. As far as he's concerned, war is destructive and wars are costly. Where the real money comes in is post-war reconstruction. So I doubt that Trump is going to cut a deal with Putin and simply give him the whole country and walk away. Unless there is some additional elements, some additional agreements between Trump and Putin in which Russia relinquishes all claims or all security interests within the Middle East or elsewhere, right? Trump says, I'll give you Ukraine, you stay out of the Middle East. Somehow I doubt that. Because as we have been hearing about over the past couple of years, this is especially true from many Republicans, Ukraine is resource rich. This is when Republicans are saying the quiet part out loud. When Ukraine is rich in natural resources, minerals, lithium, it's a cash cow. And for people like Lindsey Graham, who is, unable to, keep his mouth shut because he's too busy, brown-nosing everyone else, there's money to be made. And if the United States has given X number of dollars to the Ukrainian government to fight against Russia, they're going to want a return on that. This isn't a generous gift. This is a loan, right, with interest. And, I'm not exactly sure how much Ukrainian territory is still controlled by the Ukrainian government or how much will be sold off to international bidders as a way of paying off the debt incurred from this invasion. So, Ukraine is too lucrative for business Trump, not President Trump, to lose, right? If you look at the way in which Trump is eyeing Greenland and Canada and Gaza Strip and others, it has less to do with national prestige and more about where money can be made. So this is something to look for as far as Trump's foreign policy is concerned. But the other thing to note after all of this is that the last 3 weeks of Trump's presidency has also demonstrated a functional check on his domestic authority. So his efforts at deporting all of the illegals, en masse, his efforts at shutting down U.S. aid, trying to eliminate the Department of Education, all sorts of things like this have now been met with injunctions and blocks from the judicial branch, right? We've yet to see any real vocal opposition coming from a Republican-controlled Congress, aside from Lindsey Graham actually voicing some hesitancy about taking over Gaza. And trust me, this guy is an ardent Zionist. So for him to voice some hesitancy has less to do with any sympathy for the Palestinians and more to do with, is this feasible? Is this actually, are we even going to get away with this? There is doubt, right? There is doubt, and there are attempts at trying to block Trump and Musk's attempts at shutting things down and taking executive action in places where they feel they're, absolutely entitled to do. So with that, what can we expect to see? What can we realistically, right, expect to see? If we understand that the world is increasingly multipolar, we can conclude with very little doubt that U.S. power is somewhat diminished, right? Not weakened, but diminished. Diminished in relation to the rise of newer powers over any real significant weakening of the old. Like, a lot of times people like to think the United States is a declining power, it's a weakening power, it's a crumbling empire. I'm not willing or ready to say that just yet. I have my criticism of U.S. foreign policy. I am certainly a critic of this attempt at militarizing liberalism around the world, right? The IR school of liberalism, in which we think that we're the good guys and we need to go and rescue certain people around the world as opposed to others. I think that we still have enormous military capabilities. We still have limitless financial and economic resources. But the United States has to now recognize that there are other powers in the world that won't necessarily defeat the United States, but make certain adventures increasingly costly. And so that's why the mantra of liberalism connected to great power realism is going to be seen more and more critically by others around the world. Right? The United States still likes to think that we're the good guys. And this has been the mantra, I think, even before the Second World War. But Trump has also a record of working with political strongmen and power brokers. So, unlike, let's say, Biden or Obama or even, George W. Bush, Trump is, he's going to say that we're, the defenders of freedom and democracy. But at the end of the day, he will absolutely cut deals with people like Putin, Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un. Remember, he went to North Korea his first term, and he got a lot of flack for that, not just from Democrats, but from other Republicans. I myself thought that this was unbelievably strategic, simply because what North Korea wants more than anything else is a non-aggression pact from the United States. And, many people are saying we shouldn't, allow them to continue existing. We shouldn't give them a free pass. We give horrible states free passes all the time. We just call them our allies and strategic partners. North Korea is a different story here. So in this sense, Trump's visit to North Korea in his first term kind of gives me this sense that pragmatism, at least geopolitical pragmatism, may take a greater precedent over this sense of liberalism. It doesn't mean that I support dictatorships. It doesn't mean that, investing in democracy is a bad thing. But we need to also understand America's track record of investing in democratic development in many countries around the world usually just devolves into supporting whatever ragtag political group is happy to take our money. And they most likely cosplay democracy rather than actually believe in it. I'm sorry if I sound a little pessimistic here, but that's just kind of what it is. So beyond the change in rhetoric and tone from the Biden administration, I think that U.S. foreign policy is going to change very little, I would say. I think that there is still going to be, continued unfettered support for countries like Israel. And just so you know, the halting of all foreign aid around the world did not apply to Israel or Egypt. So money is still going to these two countries. In this, I would say that there is an expectation by some for Trump ending the wars caused by his predecessor, right? Caused by Biden. So in this sense, he's going to be looking to end the conflict with Russia over Ukraine, come to some kind of settlement in the Middle East regarding Israel, Palestine, and Syria. But there's bigger goals and objectives down the road, which I'll get to here. Okay, now just for a quick recap on how to describe a multipolar world for those that are a bit unsure. I think this is pretty self-evident to many who are following me on my page, right? A multipolar world is a system in which there are at least three or more great powers that influence international affairs. And we can add to this bipolarism and unipolarism. Bipolarism, two great powers. Unipolarism, one power. This was the United States for roughly about 30 years or so, from 1990, 1991, until about 2020, 2021. But multipolarism is a system in which you got three or more great powers, and there is no one power that's able to achieve hegemony over the others. So within the current system, the United States is clearly and undeniably still there. China is almost universally recognized as the up-and-coming challenger. Russia is in a very, safe and universally accepted third place. And Putin would even tell you that Russia is really number three behind these two. And then when we get to like 4, 5, and maybe even 6, we could think about India, maybe Iran, although at this point, I'm a bit hesitant to, keep Iran on the list, just largely because it had lost a large part of its influence within the Middle East after the collapse of the Bashar al-Assad government in Syria. But, let's just say that we just look at the U.S., China, Russia, and India as an example, right? Clearly, we are looking at multipolarism. But I also think that this current era of multipolarism also is characterized by an alignment of states into various organizations and blocs for collective benefit and security. So the United States is going to rely and continue to rely on NATO. Rumors of Trump pulling out of NATO, I think, are grossly exaggerated for a number of reasons, chief of which is that, look, the United States basically is NATO. If the United States pulls out of NATO, it loses its military leverage within Europe. So, that's not going to happen anytime soon. If it does, I will post a separate video with me just for 20 minutes saying, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that. BRICS, I think, is mostly for Russia and to a lesser extent India, and Shanghai Cooperation Organization definitely for China. Now, multipolarism certainly comes at the end of American unipolarism, and I've done numerous videos on the chronological history of the rise and fall of American unipolarism. Largely the rise and golden age of this period, the age of Pax Americana, is widely considered to be between 1990, really the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union the year following. But, Gulf War I think, made it very clear to the world that the United States was the one and only global superpower. And this had lasted, I would say, up until 9/11. 9/11 did not kill American unipolarism, but it certainly led to the decline of Pax Americana. The war on terror, the invasion of Afghanistan, the failure to capture Osama bin Laden, and then sort of the tangential wars that had taken place, primarily in Iraq, eroded global perceptions of the United States. And while the United States was still an uncontested unipolar power throughout the first decade of the 21st century, I think the decline of Pax Americana reached its moment, its climax, in the 2009 global economic recession. Now, alongside this comes the rise of the rest, alongside, or in some cases against, the West. I put the beginning of this in 2007, and really that is Putin's very famous, infamous, some would say, speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007. This was really the last time that Putin was invited to these talks. The video is available on YouTube. I can even give a link to it in the description below, or a little card up above. But if you see this video, right, and Putin is basically saying that the United States is abusing its power in that it does not recognize that the world is changing and that there are other rising powers in the world today that could and should be seen by the United States as partners for peace. This includes Russia and China. And every time the camera sort of pans over to the audience, and here you got a lot of political officials, diplomatic officials, like the look of just absolute stone cold hatred is in their eyes. Like John McCain was there, and it almost looked like he was ready to jump up and just get into a fist fight with Putin over this. But he was right? Putin, not John McCain, right? He was right in the sense that, look, unipolarism does not last forever, and that within this system, new powers rise. And these new powers could very well be cooperative with the declining unipolar power. But if the unipolar power does not choose to see them as partners and cooperators, but instead view them as adversaries, like the U.S. does, because, once again, constructivism helps us understand, if the United States sees itself as this beacon of liberalism in the world, then it is going to see its own intervention as forces for good, whereas Russia, China, and other countries are seen as autocratic, non-democratic, anti-democratic, and if they question American hegemony, they're also perceived to be anti-American as well. So the decline of Pax Americana is certainly accelerated through the rise of the rest. to which the end, right, the definitive end, which is, unipolar powers don't last as long as the United States does. And if you really think about this, this is effectively a 30 to 31 year period. The end of Pax Americana is really about a decade and change, right, in which you see a number of things happening. First of all, the global economic recession puts a major dent in the mindset that neoliberalism, in here I'm talking about the economic model, right, is the sine qua non, the sinecure for all of the world's problems. What we also see from 09 to 21, right, is a rise in tension between the West and Russia, the rise of the Chinese economy, the erosion of America's war on terror. Now, a lot of this was coded within an 8-year period with Barack Obama. But make no mistake, Obama's presidency may have halted or slowed America's unipolar decline. But foreign policy-wise, Barack Obama was just as invasive and just as hard policy as his predecessor, George W. Bush, which I think that 2021, the collapse of the American-supported government in Afghanistan and the takeover of the country by the Taliban in as many days as the United States had occupied the country in years, put to rest any sense of American global hegemonic superiority, right? The flight of people to the airport in Kabul, right? That was this modern day generation's Saigon moment, right? This was effectively the collapse of this generation's South Vietnamese government. And, for a couple of years, I think the Biden administration had done everything possible to deny the end of Pax Americana, but it was abundant. I mean, it was obvious, right, that the United States no longer has the geopolitical clout that it once had. To this, we can see that while this isn't so much indicative of the decline of unipolarism, but that areas of the world that continue to be under American influence are seen increasingly as less equal partnerships, and as I said before, more of a growing dependency. The European Union is now increasingly tethered to that of NATO. The EU has its own stance in regards to Ukraine and Russia, and the rhetoric is, for the most part, empty and meaningless. NATO tends to have more of a visible presence. It is NATO, for better or for worse, that contributed to the security dilemma that led to the outbreak of conflict with Russia over Ukraine. But Europe is really just becoming more of a dependency of the United States than really anything else. And the fact that NATO is continuing to grow after the launch of the so-called special military operation, as many of you know, Sweden and Finland had joined NATO. And, if I were Volodymyr Zelensky at this point, I would start getting really offended. It's just that, my country was invaded by Russia. My goal is to join NATO. My hope is to become a NATO member so NATO can respond. And two neutral countries, Sweden and Finland, just kind of waltz on in, to which NATO's response to Ukraine's membership is, are you ready for this? You can join NATO once you have defeated Russia on the battlefield. To which, I would say, well, if I defeated Russia, why do I need to join NATO at that point? So, a lot of the rhetoric coming from the United States about, universal human rights and democracy and freedom and liberty, they sound good. But increasingly, it is met with skepticism, not just from the non-West, but from skeptics within the West itself. Increasingly, protests are seen as little more than color revolutions, which don't make the countries in question better. They just bring to power pro-Western governments that are just as dependent on the West as they might have at one point been, towards Moscow. There's no less no less authoritarian, but it's just packaged differently. And whether we want to acknowledge the relevancy, the growing relevancy of BRICS, I mean, that's a topic that can be put into a separate video. Some have said that BRICS is the wave of the future. Others have said that BRICS is, it pales in comparison to the G7. There's no organization with BRICS. There's no central headquarters. How are they going to harmonize the economies that run the gamut from China on one end to, Ethiopia on the other? Is it just really a club of non-Americans or the people who just don't like using the dollar? BRICS has a lot of things that they need to decide. And, as membership increases, let's sort of look at the map here. As membership increases, BRICS is going to become more cumbersome. So, the countries in dark blue are now full BRICS members. So you have Russia, China, India, Indonesia, Ethiopia, UAE, Iran, Ethiopia down here, South Africa, and Brazil. Partners, and these are now a new status, include Belarus, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Thailand, Nigeria, Uganda, Bolivia, and Cuba. Candidate states that are looking to join in the near future: Venezuela, Syria, Senegal, if I'm not mistaken, Azerbaijan, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Burma. So BRICS is growing. But the thing is that without any central organization, this is going to become an incredibly unruly, mismanaged organization, which, if nothing else, is little more than an association of countries that will be engaging in some form of tariff-free, free trade agreements. But other than that, how it will combat the G7, sort of remains to be seen. On the other end of the spectrum, we also were talking about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the biggest project in there, China's One Belt, One Road policy. Now here, we really begin to see the emerging influence of China. The overland routes across Central Asia and the sea routes across the Indian Ocean are giving the global South and the non-Western world a greater sense of at least economic and infrastructural integration. This is something that Trump or anybody in the White House is going to have to now contend with. So while you still have the transatlantic trade routes, the Panama Canal and the Atlantic Ocean largely being under the influence and control of the United States, the rest of the world is becoming integrated into an increasingly large Chinese infrastructural network. All right, so with all of that, what can we, realistically expect in the next 4 years, especially when it comes to things like Ukraine, the Palestinian Territories, Iran, Syria, Latin America, North America now? I mean, who would have thought that we would be talking about North America? And even East Asia, right, in which all strategic eyes are really on China. Now, before I go into detail in just a couple of minutes about Ukraine, Iran, and East Asia, right, I want to address some of the other topics here. I think one of the big ones is the Palestinian Territories. So right now, we are still at a ceasefire regarding Gaza, but the media seems to be ignoring the continued conflict, the continued attacks on Palestinian communities in the West Bank. And so ultimately the Palestinian Territories comes as a package deal, right? It's not just Gaza or the West Bank separately, but it's both of them. And this is an incredibly, incredibly difficult issue for one simple reason. Aside from rhetorical support for a Palestinian state, there isn't any real active will to make this happen. Russia supports it. China supports it. Much of the Arab world supports it, but as we also know, many Arab countries, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, even Lebanon, they all turn a blind eye and a deaf ear to the plight of the Palestinian people. They will say they will not take the Palestinians as refugees, and they can say that simply by pointing to, if that happens, that effectively gives a green light to ethnic cleansing. But they also will not take them in because they don't want them. And they also it's the worst kept secret out there, do business with Israel. So in order for Trump's vision of Gaza being turned into Mar-a-Lago Part 2, in order for that to be prevented, there needs to be an active will to ensure security of the Palestinians. So what can we expect in the next 4 years? At best, if there is really no support coming from the United States itself, no military support, no congressional support, no nothing besides just Trump and a few hardliners and, diehard Zionists, then the idea of ethnically cleansing the Palestinians will be nothing more than just that, an idea. But we also need to understand that Gaza is almost entirely rubble at this point. So it needs enormous humanitarian aid. In order for that to happen, we need at the absolute least some kind of UN presence in the region. If not, the military and logistical presence of another country. And the only one I can think of in the region that might be willing to do this is Turkey. But Turkey plays both sides, right? Erdogan's government has, open issues, open economic relations with Israel while condemning their atrocities, within the Palestinian territories. So unless there is some, as I said, some real resolve to counter Trump's vision for cleaning the area out of rubble and people and just starting from degree zero, I don't know. I mean, I honestly don't know what will happen here yet. It's still too early to figure out. And many people are still thinking whether or not Trump's vision for doing this is just little more than fantasy, right? I think the same goes for Latin America and North America. If we were to take Rubio's vision of a multipolar world at face value, it implies that the U.S. is going to be pulling out of areas in the world that it does not see a strategic interest in. This may mean giving Putin pretty much the lion's share of what he's demanding within Ukraine. This also means relinquishing any real investment in Central Asia, South Asia, Africa. But this also implies blowing the dust off the Monroe Doctrine, of which I have no doubt that Rubio will want to ensure compliant, pro-American, pro-capitalist, anti-socialist governments throughout Latin America. I'm pretty certain that he and the current president of Argentina, Milei, are going to just get along flawlessly. Again, I could be wrong, but that's where I'm going with this. Latin America is going to be seen as America's backyard. And this will involve extracting China's influence from the region, which it has grown in the last couple of years. When it comes to North America, and here I'm talking about Canada, a lot of people say Trump can't be serious about what he's thinking about in Canada. And I'm not going down that rabbit hole of conspiracy theories. I mean, I'm pretty comfortable in saying that Canada will not become the 51st state. I cannot imagine this happening at all, but we in the United States tend to overlook the growing internal divisions, the socioeconomic, socio-political divisions in Canada, not brought on by the current Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, but certainly exacerbated as such. There is Canada's own, MAGA movement within its political circles. You have always the specter of Quebecois separatism. You also have this growing problem between, let's say, the major urban centers like Toronto and Vancouver and Ottawa versus everything else. So to suggest that Canada is this, peaceful little paradise that, provides a wonderful alternative to what American life is, that's not the case at all. My best prognosis for what Trump will do, as far as Canada is concerned, is continue to exacerbate these problems to the point where Trudeau, who is increasingly unpopular, will lose the next election, which is either going to go to either another neoliberal centrist, will just simply drag the country out for another 4 to 5 years, or follow trends that we see in many parliamentary democracies in Europe, where national populist movements are gaining support by an increasingly alienated and disappointed public. So it's not that far-fetched to think that the Trump phenomenon in the United States will influence Canadian politics as well. So, making Canada the 51st state is certainly not going to happen, but making Canada much more likely to integrate with this new sense of Trump economics is something to, definitely look for. And then, of course, when we get to, East Asia, I'm just going to get to that in just a couple of minutes here. So why don't we just move on to the others, right? Ukraine and the post-Trump summit. Many of you who subscribe to my page do so because of Russian foreign policy, the ongoing war in Ukraine, and the possible outcomes, for this fight. This here is as current a map of control of Ukraine as possible. Russia continues to hold significant amounts of territory in Ukraine's east and south. For those that are wondering about Ukraine's incursion into the Kursk area, this is all that they control. So for those who think that, Ukraine is somehow crippling Russia by invading its own territory, I've said before that this is a complete waste of military manpower and resources when it should be done down here. Russia did not take the bait as Ukraine had hoped and continues to hold the line and advance in Ukraine's east and south. The expectations for peace, and about less than a year ago, Putin had given a press conference, an address to the members of the Ministry of Defense, and listed Russia's demands for peace regarding Ukraine. And these three things remain basically red line items for Russia today. The first is the international recognition of Crimea, Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson to Russia. All five of these regions have now been annexed to Russia. Russia sees them as its own sovereign territory. But in order for a ceasefire, in order for the war to end, the international community, as well as the government in Kiev, whoever they happen to be, needs to recognize this territorial loss. Number two, Ukraine needs to commit to permanent military neutrality, which includes not only no possibility of membership in NATO, but the removal of all NATO military and technical presence from the country. And number three is the very large and abstract notion of denazification of Ukrainian politics and culture. Among other things, this includes the restoration of Soviet-era, especially Soviet-era war memorials and monuments in the country, the elimination of Ukrainian being the only official language in the country, the ending of what Russia regards as historical, linguistic, educational, and religious discrimination against the Russian-speaking population, as well as an end to the persecution of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate. Now, in the last week or so, Trump's peace proposal to Putin was allegedly leaked to Telegram channels. And take this as it comes, take this for whatever the Telegram channels say. I subscribe to about a dozen of them. And yeah, they tend to be more pro-Russian than pro-Ukrainian, but they all kind of agree on what was allegedly given to officials in Kiev. So this is just what I'm just simply reporting what I've read on Telegram. But Trump's proposal to Russia over Ukraine comes with the following terms. The first is a ceasefire along the entire front line and a withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from Kursk. So this falls short of full control of the five territories that Russia wants. Number two, Ukraine will not seek to return the territories that are controlled by Russia. So they acknowledge that these territories are no longer in their control, but they are not required to recognize its losses. They can simply chalk them up to occupied territory. Number 3, Ukraine declares neutrality and withdraws membership application to NATO. It doesn't say permanent neutrality, but it just simply says for the time being, Ukraine's talk of NATO membership is off the table. As a counter proposal, as a counter offer, as a parting gift, Ukraine will be able to join the European Union by 2030. The United States will maintain support for modernizing Ukraine's army in the meantime, and if all of this is agreed to, the West, including the United States, will lift some of the Russian sanctions that are imposed on it. New elections in Ukraine will be called for a brand new government. As we all know, the government of Zelensky had expired last May. Ukraine is being governed under some kind of emergency martial law right now. New elections with Ukraine will be called with the full participation of Russian-speaking parties, many of which have been seen as traitorous, anti-Ukrainian, and pro-Russian. So all of these political parties will be able to participate once again, and the persecution of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate will cease. Now, whether that includes a restoration of seized property is something that will be hashed out within the peace agreements. So this is Russia's proposal. This is what allegedly Trump is bringing to the table. The assessment in all of this is that a peace agreement will most likely not be met if Trump insists on all of these items at the expense of what Russia wants. So a peace deal is unlikely, especially to Russia, if Ukraine maintains military assistance from the West. So even if there is no NATO, the fact that the U.S. and NATO will continue to militarily support Ukraine may be something that Russia rejects. Even if that is met, there is no say, there is no guarantee that other NATO members will accept this deal. And this is especially true among the hardline NATO members like Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, and even Finland. Largely because if NATO is operating along the liberalist paradigm, liberalist states don't like to accept defeat. Right? You don't accept defeat, especially if you accept defeat, against a perceived authoritarian power. Right? This is the reason why the United States oftentimes gets so bogged down in conflict, because to pull out of said conflict, right? And this is taken from the years of George W. Bush. The terrorists win, the bad guys win, even if you're not winning the war. Even if at the absolute best, this is just being dragged out into some proxy frozen conflict that is costing you resources every single day, to end the war, to pull out, basically gives the other side victory. So whether or not NATO agrees to this is something that will have to be agreed upon really by NATO. The more likely scenario is that if talks break down between Trump and Putin, Trump may very well likely say, I'm pulling all aid to Ukraine. It's not worth our fight. And I will make this Europe's problem. Right? We're just going to dump it into Europe's lap. In which case, Ukraine is in an even worse position, especially if factions within Europe argue over how to handle this. As I said, you've got the hardliners on one side. Poland could be seen as the major military sponsor now. They are the biggest recipients of NATO aid and armaments since the launch of the special military operation. But this also presupposes that governments in major countries like Germany and France are going to continue to want to do this. There are elections coming up in both countries, as many people are following right now. And here I'm talking, February 9th, 2025. The most popular party in Germany is AfD, right? Alternative für Deutschland. And right now, the party is polling at somewhere around 20 to 25%. Now, if these polls are reflected directly within votes, the good news for all of you non-AFD fans is that AFD does not have anywhere near enough votes to form a government. And the additional good news is that there is no major political parties in Germany that will work with AFD, right? So as you know, you have to form coalitions in order to get over 50% of the vote. The bad news is that the most likely government is a grand coalition between the Christian Democratic Union, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, the SPD, and heaven help us all, the Green Party. Ironically, the Greens in Germany are the most war-torn, belligerent party out there. They used to be the party of pacifism, environmentalism. For whatever reason now, they're the one party that's most likely willing to start World War III. A grand coalition of CDU, SPD, and the Greens would be a very cumbersome political party, chiefly because the SPD and the Greens are increasingly unpopular in Germany today. And the CDU took a major hit a couple of days ago when it was revealed that they agree with some of the anti-immigration policies of AFD. Right? And this is usually a normal tactic when a moderate right-of-center party is trying to maintain its relevance in a country where there is a rising national right-wing populist party. They oftentimes will take some of the rhetoric of that populist party, but then tell the voters, well, we're going to do it more humanely, or we're going to do it more organized and more democratically. And that, of course, just immediately backfired. So, voter apathy in Germany is reaching, critical levels here, which explains why, AFD is so popular. And then when we get to France, Macron's popularity rating is somewhere hovering around the mid to low 20s. And so, as I said in the beginning of this discussion, if Macron is now seen as the new Merkel, the new leader of Europe, that's a pretty pathetic leader, to say anything here. So there's always the specter of the National Front coming to power in France as well. Again, I don't know what's going to happen. We all thought a couple of years ago, last year in parliamentary elections, that the National Front was just going to sweep through in the French parliament, and that didn't work. That did not happen. So there's always, the unknown. But suffice to say, in major countries like Germany and France, there are internal divisions that show Europe is not ready to be united on what to do with Ukraine. And if right-wing parties continue to influence German, French, even Italian politics, support for Ukraine over the years is just going to wither, amid calls for a re-engagement, right, with Russia. So at the end of the day, Ukraine, as I've said since the start of this whole conflict, is screwed. Ukraine is most likely destined to become an internally divided and failed state for the foreseeable future. What areas remain under Western influence will most likely be sold in piecemeal. As we've already talked about, there is this idea that Ukraine is rich in resources, which is what the West wants. The eastern parts will just simply be, integrated within Russia. Okay, so moving on to Iran, and this is an interesting development because I don't think it's been reported as much or is given as much attention as it should. But shortly after the new year, Iran's current president visited Moscow and secured a number of agreements with Russia. There was actually a press conference video that was released on the Kremlin's website. I was looking over the transcripts to see whether it was worth providing the subtitles for just a lot of technical issues. But I'm going to provide also a link to that transcript because there's some interesting things that have come out of that. And this is really part of this so-called Treaty on Comprehensive Strategic Partnership between the two countries. A lot of this involves things like, technology, information and cybersecurity, peaceful nuclear energy collaboration, counterterrorism efforts, environmental issues, combating money laundering and organized crime. But here's the key, the Caspian Sea. And the Caspian Sea thing is something that's going to become quite important in the next couple of minutes here. Part of this comprehensive partnership also includes a clause that prohibits both parties from supporting or assisting aggressors against each other, as well as from allowing their territories to be used as bases for such actions. It's basically highly technical wording that says neither country will take part in international sanctions against the other. Neither country will engage in any sort of military confrontation against the other by third parties. Right? So this is really, in my opinion, a way of giving Iran the ability, the maneuverability, to pivot away from the Middle East and towards Central Asia, right? And this is coming largely on the heels of the collapse of the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad. And, I had a talk with my colleague, Piotr Kurzin, who runs his own page, The Global Gambit. And we were talking about the fall of the Assad government in late December, something like that, right? And who were the biggest winners and who were the biggest losers. And we both agreed that the biggest loser in all of this, besides the Assad government itself, was Iran, because the Assad government had provided that necessary bridge between Iran and Iraq through Syria to influence Lebanon, especially Hezbollah. And more importantly to this is that the biggest winner in the collapse of the Assad government was Israel, who now has some kind of manipulative ally in Damascus. As you all know, northern Syria is largely now occupied by Turkish forces. Southern Syria, is occupied by Israeli forces, and it eliminates, right? It eliminates the Iranian factor in influencing events, not just in Syria, but also in Lebanon. Knowing also that Trump is a major proponent of putting Iran in the crosshairs, the United States sees Iran as public enemy number one within the Middle East and is more than happy to either directly engage Iran or allow Israel to do so. This treaty with Russia, and there was a treaty that Iran conducted about a year earlier with China, says a lot about what Iran can do and where it's moving. Now, the important thing to note here is that Iran's oil fields, gas fields, pipelines, and others, right, are now being integrated more and more with Russia's non-European, non-Western network. That's why I said the Caspian Sea is so important to this comprehensive treaty. Because if you look at the map here, what borders Iran immediately to the north here? You have Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is now closely allied once again with Russia. If you remember, about a year or two ago, Azerbaijan had successfully conquered much of the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh. I had done a separate video about this, but Russia had remained neutral for more than 20 years regarding the Armenian-Azerbaijan conflict over Karabakh. And then suddenly, Russia comes what seems to be in favor of Azerbaijan's side when the current Prime Minister of Armenia, Nikol Pashinyan, had declared last March that Karabakh is part of Azerbaijan's territorial integrity. And as such, this kind of gave a green light to Aliyev to say, okay, we're going to just simply take it over. And Russia just seemed to have thrown Armenia under the bus. Now, why is this? There could be a number of reasons, but one that I'm running with is that Azerbaijan is much more resource-rich than Armenia is. Armenia is small potatoes when it comes to Russia. Allying with Azerbaijan provides a number of strategic advantages. First of all, it moves Azerbaijan away from what it had previously been known to flirt economically with the West. Secondly, by placing Azerbaijan within Russia's new economic sphere of influence, it all but guarantees Iran becomes much more important for Russia, especially as pipelines will now run north-south from Azerbaijan through Iran into the Persian Gulf. We also have to take into effect that Iran is a member of BRICS. So what this all means is that Iran may, and I need to underscore may because none of this is guaranteed, but it may pivot away from the Middle East into Central and Southern Asia. But more to just simply than that, right? As I've already mentioned, the fall of the Assad government in Syria weakened Iran's presence in the Middle East. This makes it vulnerable for U.S. and Israeli interference. By repositioning Iran into Central and South Asia with Russian and Chinese cooperation, it gives them economic protection, but it also gives them diplomatic protection. The United States is much less likely, in my opinion, to openly engage with Iran if Iran can rely on partnerships and alliances from these larger countries. So it limits the potential interference that the United States and more likely Israel can do. This puts Lebanon within an uncertain future. It puts Hezbollah within an uncertain future. As far as Iraq, and remember Iraq, like Afghanistan, no one ever talks about these countries again. They were front and center keywords 15, 20 years ago. Now, no one talks about them. But this might also pull Iraq into this more central Eurasian sphere of economic cooperation more so than the Middle East. So think about the consolidation of BRICS, think about the projects, think also about how BRICS and Shanghai cooperation are largely overlapping, particularly when it comes to One Belt, One Road, right? All of these things are connected with one another. And that is why the ultimate goal for Trump, I think, is China, right? At the end of the day, Trump wants to wrap up all of these little open-ended issues with Ukraine, with Russia, the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and ultimately focus on China. I was talking with a colleague of mine a couple of weeks ago, this is before I had left the United States, and he was able to attend the last NATO security conference in Europe. And while he was there, he was talking to a number of military officials, policy analysts, among others. And again, this is just simply take it at face value here. But the radio chatter coming from the State Department and the Pentagon is that for all of America's investments in future engagement around the world, right, 10% of the Pentagon's time and attention and budget, along with the State Department, right, goes to Russia. Another 10% goes roughly to the rest of the world. The final 80% is China. China, China, China. East Asia, Southeast Asia, that is basically the end goal. That's the prize, that's the eyes on the prize here. So Trump's rhetoric about China, which during his campaign, right, he's going to economically emancipate the United States from China's control, that China is taking U.S. patented interests and stealing it. It sounds confrontational, but it would be unbelievably destructive if the United States engaged in open economic conflict with China. So at the end of the day, I'm going to say what to expect with China, something between cooperative or confrontational. Right? China is viewed as America's chief and long-term competitor, economically, politically, militarily. Russia is, the warm-up before the open engagement with China. As I had said, Trump wants to engage in some kind of economic independence, even though we are economically tethered to China. Fights over intellectual property. China is constantly accused of pirating American patented products. And I'm sure many of you heard about it, what was it, about a week and a half ago. The AI market was just effectively blown out of the water by China effectively taking some ideas from the United States, making better AI, and then just making them publicly domain. So no patent, no subscription, no nothing. That's basically what the Chinese do. Along with that, we have rival currencies, which I will say the dollar is still king, but the Chinese yuan is widely seen as the biggest competitor to dollar diplomacy. And, we've been constantly hearing chatter about de-dollarization, especially when it comes to BRICS and the rest. Well, what currency is going to be used? Well, right now everybody's talking about their own national currencies, but the Chinese yuan is seen as the most likely competitor to the idea of the dollar being the universal form of currency. So, what can we expect from Trump? Are we openly going to engage with China? Are we going to openly go to economic war with them? I would say this is more jingoism than realism. Because if the United States wants to economically emancipate itself from China, we better be prepared to spend $150 to $200 on blue jeans. We better be prepared to accept rising cost in products that we have long accepted as cheap and replaceable coming from, Chinese markets. But even more to the point, if we end up effectively detaching ourselves from the Chinese economic system, it hurts us in the long run as well because we are so interdependent with each other. I mean, China is a major trading partner with the United States. And, more so, I'm sure that many of you know, China is the largest holder of U.S. debt. So if China was to ever call in that debt, it would basically kill the U.S. economy. And the only reason why they're doing it, well, there's a bunch of reasons, but the primary reason why they're not doing it is because if the U.S. economy collapses, we're taking China with us, right? You just sort of imagine the two countries grabbing each other by the throats. And so if China is able to choke us, we fall down and we pull China down with us down the cliff. The other thing is the Taiwan factor. Are we going to is China going to effectively invade Taiwan? That's one of the big things. If Russia can take Ukraine, can China take Taiwan? I mean, China has made it very, very clear that their foreign policy is the eventual reintegration of Taiwan with mainland Chinese politics. By peaceful means, preferably by military means, if absolutely necessary. Will Trump create a security dilemma that forces China to take the bait and effectively, preemptively take Taiwan? Will that force us into a military confrontation with China? Will Taiwan be seen as a bargaining chip? In terms of, will Trump meet with Xi Jinping and say, Taiwan's your issue to solve in exchange for dollar supremacy or in exchange for some kind of economic security guarantees, right, in which intellectual property is still maintained, there's greater degrees of currency supremacy, whatever have you. These things are up in the air. Can Taiwan be used as a bargaining chip? If necessary, right, absolutely. So the overall assessments, I want to wrap this little talk up here because we're coming up on almost an hour and a half. And if you're still with me, I really appreciate you listening. I would say the first thing to make of 2025, separate Trump's rhetoric from what he actually does and what he can actually do. Much of what he says is idealistic. Can he basically engage in the forcible removal of over 1 million Palestinians from Gaza? In a way, yes, he could, but will he? Is he able to muster the resources in order to do that? And what's the fallout as a result? Will the Palestinians resist? Many of them have said, if I'm going to die, I'm going to die on my own soil. And if it's nothing but rubble, so be it. Will he be able to do that? Again, there's an idea of what could be done versus the cost and the repercussions. What about Canada? What about Greenland? What about Ukraine? The rhetoric that he uses can oftentimes be seen as internal consumption only. Is he able to really accomplish this? That still remains to be seen. How much influence and clout does the United States still have? And if he's able to put one of his ideas into action, what does that do for America's overall geopolitical security? What does that do for the way in which the rest of the world sees us, trusts us, and takes us for our word? Up until now, again, he's only been president for a little less than a month. There have been checks and injunctions on many of his actions internally here, right? Judges have halted the seizure and arrest of undocumented immigrants. The attempt at shutting down U.S. aid completely, systematically dismantling it, has now been put on indefinite hold. We don't know where that's going to go. So a lot of things that are being reported, we need to understand that there are still checks in place against what he can actually do. When it comes to Ukraine, and I've been saying this now for nearly 3 years, Russia, if anything, is not losing, and Ukraine is not winning. Ukraine is not regaining any of the territory back. They're losing a town almost every other day. And if Telegram channels are to be taken seriously, Ukraine's line of defense is about to be broken. And if U.S. aid halts and Ukraine does not get the aid that it has previously relied on, the funding for its defense is going to dry up very quickly. And if Russia is able to break through those fortified military defense lines that had been set up since 2014, they've got effectively an open green line as far as possible. Now, I'm not exactly sure how Russia is able to do this. You know, there's a lot of things we're able to say. Can Russia take Kiev? Will they take Odessa? Some people are saying it's just a matter of time, wait and see. Others are saying the reason why Russia is taking as slow as it is because that's the reality of what Russia is capable of doing. But right now, Russia has the advantage. They are not losing in Ukraine. War fatigue, support for the war is beginning to take its toll in the United States, in Europe, and elsewhere. People are saying it's an unwinnable war. The best thing to do right now is to just call for a ceasefire and wait for a better day, for a better advantage. Even if that happens, that reduces Ukraine to a Bosnia-like scenario, which many analysts in the West have said they absolutely do not want. But at this point, I don't know if there's anything else that they can get. When we look at Iran, this is a wait-and-see thing. I kind of look at this arrangement with Russia and China as a strategic realignment of Iran's long-term interests. It means that Iran's gambit for trying to be the hegemon or the great influential power in the Middle East has been greatly reduced since the collapse of the Assad government in Syria. Iran is not counted out, but I wouldn't regard Iran as the major power that it was a couple of months ago. If anything, this realignment towards Central and Southern Asia is a strategic move for survival, especially knowing the retaliatory measures that could be taken, not just by the United States, but by Israel. Or if the United States gives Israel the green light to say, Iran's weak, go and hit it. And then is the other country, Turkey. We haven't talked about Turkey that much here, but if there is a country, I said in the beginning of this talk, that might be the most proactive in ensuring the security of the Palestinians in Gaza, it could, I'm not saying it will, but it could be Turkey. If they are able to do what they're doing in Syria and, claim swaths of territory as a security corridor, as a security barrier, they may take it upon themselves in some neo-Ottoman nationalistic thing that Erdogan still believes in, right, as a way of safeguarding the Gaza Strip and rebuilding, right, everything. I don't know. We just have to keep an eye on it. The Middle East is still very much a chessboard. And when it comes to China, there's no doubt that China is still the rising power and may very well overtake the United States as the largest economy in the world soon. But its GDP growth that we saw years ago that grew by 8%, 10%, 13% a year, those days are gone, right? China's economic growth now is around 3%, 4%. Its growth is plateauing, right? It's sort of reaching a moment of equilibrium, in which case its growth and further development will become increasingly dependent on its involvement and cooperation with other BRICS and Shanghai Cooperation members. So the days of the Chinese economic juggernauts, right, those days where it's just increasingly by, a number of factors, right, no longer there. So in this case, China is going to need to rely on a number of additional partners: Russia, India, Iran, and the Central Asian countries. And, as a final thing, it's because of where I'm located and who my audience has been for the last couple of weeks now. Where does Central Asia fit? Right? Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, among others. In my post-communist class, I have a section on Central Asia, and I differentiate the region between Central Asia 1.0 and Central Asia 2.0. 1.0 were the top-heavy, authoritative presidents that came to power in the 90s and remained in power until either their deaths or their ousters only a couple of years ago. Central Asia 2.0, and this is particular for the leadership in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. The new presidents are much more economic reformists. They're willing to open the country up for tourism, investment, and other types of institutional engagement. Right? Hence the idea of, English language universities, not just from the United States, but also from the UK, from Germany, from Italy. The leadership is engaged in a type of performance legitimacy through economic transformation and consumerism. So, cities like Tashkent and Almaty and Astana are transforming. Every single time I come back here, the place just looks different. Now, what does that mean? It means that Central Asia is becoming an incredibly important transit corridor and business hub for a uniting Eurasian continent. And this is important for Russia, China, Iran, and India for their own separate reasons. But as the number of key cities that I mentioned continues to grow, and here we can also include Dushanbe in Tajikistan, Samarkand in Uzbekistan. These cities are going to be key points for not only infrastructural integration through China's One Belt, One Road policy, but these are emerging economies that are going to be key allies and partners with Russia, China, as well as Iran. I wouldn't say that Iran is a major power in comparison to these. But as I've said to some of my colleagues in Uzbekistan, the Iranians are going to be seen more and more in Central Asia in the next coming years, especially if they pivot away from the Middle East. Iran's presence will most likely be seen in Afghanistan and Tajikistan, two countries that are more Persian-speaking than the others. But also knowing Iran, Russia, and China, and India are all BRICS members. And knowing that Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan are now BRICS partners, which may very well become BRICS members down the road, this fits in rather nicely into the strategy of both President Tokayev and President Mirziyoyev, the presidents of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, respectively, their sense of multi-vector foreign policy. Right? This is an interesting topic which I'll devote in a separate video. But multi-vector foreign policy is very much reflective of multipolarism. And that is, both of these countries are willing to work with whoever wants to work with them. Russia, China, India, Iran, Turkey, the United States, Germany, you name it. But it also implies that Central Asia is becoming more and more of their own little power brokers. They're not just simply susceptible to whatever the Chinese or the Russians say, but they are becoming smaller partners that are looking at an expansion of SCO and an expansion of BRICS for their own economic gain. This is something that the United States, I think, is very much late to the game in. And even though the United States does have a presence within the region, it is very much a third seat presence. And if Trump is really thinking that the world is multipolar and each part of the world is under the influence of one great power, then it means that the United States is going to disengage from large parts of the world where it doesn't see that it's of any strategic interest. It's going to focus on the Middle East, on Latin America, and probably continue to hold some residual influence within Europe. Other places like let's say, Kosovo and Serbia. Let's see where we go with, upcoming elections here. But in this regard, folks, right, I just simply want to say that 2025 is really the age in which multipolar power politics is going to really be on display. Knowing the leaders of three countries, Trump in the US, Putin in Russia, and Xi Jinping in China, these are power brokers who, like the great power politics of Bismarckian Europe of old, are going to decide the fate of millions by what is in each other's strategic interest and what is the bottom dollar. Right? So that is effectively my little take on where we are in 2025. I could be wrong on a lot of these things, right? And I just simply want to say, anybody on YouTube that is offering their take on things, it's just an assessment based on observable data. They could be right, they could be wrong. If in another 6 to 8 months, things that I've said here are affirmed, I'll be happy. If things go completely different, I will be absolutely surprised, but I'll explain why they went the way that they did. So anyway, thank you for sort of listening to my talk. I'm sorry once again that I haven't been as active on my page as I was last year. Again, setting up my classes here in Tashkent and just waiting for things to sort of come down the pipeline as far as Trump and Putin and other things has kind of made January and February a little bit more quiet. But again, I'm still trying to make sense of where we are in this new age of Trump. And, any thoughts, comments, ideas that you may have, please put them in the comments sections. If you have differing opinions, I'm happy to read them and answer, anything if there's, of note. But anyways, thank you for listening, and I will see you all next time.